The fearless queen of American talk shows, Wendy Williams, made the Wendy Williams Show a blazing daytime television ritual and left her mark on the most daring periods in media history. Wendy rose with fire and defiance from restless beginnings in lonely radio studios where few trusted her voice. She turned truth into a social phenomenon and rumors into a cultural gospel. She was more than just a host for decades. At noon, she was America's lifeblood. Millions of people relied on the uncensored voice for shock, laughter, and an odd form of solace. Rewriting the role of women in broadcasting and demonstrating that courage can emerge even from wounds so deep they could destroy anyone. Wendy's unwavering candor and unvarnished confessions made her the unbreakable mirror of glory and pain. However, there is a battlefield engulfed in grief and darkness behind that shining kingdom. Miscarriages that left unseen graves in her heart and tore apart her soul. Her marriage was destroyed by betrayal, and her house was reduced to ashes. And the constant sicknesses that plagued her body and haunted her soul. Life is crueler than ever now that I'm 61. Is there any pain more destructive than this? Before we start, please leave a like and a heart as a show of support to help Wendy weather the storm. If her laughter once filled your emptiness, and her voice once filled your lonely afternoons, once a heartbreakingly lonely girl, measured not by her dreams but by the ruthless numbers on a bathroom scale, stood behind the bold crown of American talk show fame. On July 18, 1964, Wendy Joan Williams was born in Asbury Park, New Jersey, the middle child in a family that appeared stable and well off from the outside. Her mother Shirley and father Thomas were both highly qualified teachers with advanced degrees who were well respected in their community. They brought discipline and strict expectations to their kids. Wendy, however, did not view childhood as a time of liberation. It was a battlefield of silent wounds and judgment. When Wendy was only 6 years old, riots broke out in Asbury Park during the summer of 1970. The Williams family was forced to relocate to the more tranquil Ocean Township as the streets were torn apart by flames. It was an escape to safety for outsiders. It was the start of Wendy's loneliness. She carried the debilitating realization that she did not belong in her new classrooms, which were nearly entirely filled with white faces. Her everyday burden was loneliness, which turned into her shadow. Her haven was precarious even at home. By the time she was 12, Wendy's meals were scrutinized as if each bite were a transgression, and weekly weigh-ins became humiliating rituals. The kitchen was a place of warmth for most kids, and she would later remember with painful honesty, "I was just a kid, but they were already watching every bite I took." It was a courtroom of judgment for Wendy. Gaining a pound was equivalent to a sentence. A temporary pardon was taken away from each pound. What could be more tragic than teaching a child to be afraid of her own body? Her spirit became a prisoner and her body a battlefield. The suffering didn't stop there. She was labeled as hyperactive, restless, noisy, and too much for the quiet environment by her teachers. Medication was prescribed by doctors to control her energy. However, the medication didn't help. They were confined. Wendy's memory was brutally clear. There was no remedy in the pills. They were a cage. Before she had a chance to blossom, her laughter waned, her spark faded, and she was plagued by the question of whether she was broken throughout her life. She carried the oppressive loneliness of being misinterpreted in a house full of books and diplomas. She wasn't hungry, homeless, or destitute. However, the fact that her suffering was invisible, quantified in whispers, scales, and the embarrassment of being too large, too noisy, or too different, did not make it any less cruel. Nevertheless, something remarkable was being forged inside that ruthless furnace. Her empire would eventually be ignited by the tragedy of silence, the cruelty of labels, and the humiliation of diets. Through her uncensored voice, the girl who was cruelly misunderstood, mercilessly judged, and heartbreakingly silenced rose to create a kingdom. She demonstrated to the world that sometimes the most broken children become the most powerful voices of a generation, that no wound is too deep to silence a spirit, and that no cage is too strong to contain a destiny. Wendy Williams realized a harsh and exciting truth the first time she sat under the red glow of the on-air light. She could be saved or destroyed by her voice. What could be more devastating than finding a gift so potent that it held the potential for greatness, but every time you used it, it threatened to destroy you? After graduating from Northeastern University, Wendy took her first radio position in St. Croix, Virgin Islands in 1986. It appeared to be paradise from the outside. Blue waters, palm trees, and a young lady pursuing her dreams. It was, in fact, exile. The isolation was oppressive, the hours were harsh, and the pay was low. She announced weather updates to strangers who hardly knew her name while sitting in a forgotten booth. She gave up after just a few months, broke, worn out, and questioning everything she had ever thought about herself. She briefly believed that everything was fine, that she was insufficient, and that her voice was too loud. She refused to give up back on the mainland. Wendy started sending out demo tapes. Every cassette was a plastic-sealed fragment of her soul. Rejection became commonplace. There were heaps of letters. There were no calls. Like a verdict, silence stretched. She later acknowledged, "I believed for a long time that no one wanted me or my voice." But she continued. Her belief kept her alive. Radio gave me the freedom to be as loud as I wanted, and nobody could stop me. She finally made her breakthrough in 1989. At the age of 22, she first appeared in Washington, D.C. and then Philadelphia. Her fire caught fire at Philadelphia's Power 99. Wendy dared to remove the mask, while other hosts remained safe behind pleasantries and playlists. She transformed secrets into spectacle and rumors into gospel. Her bold signature was the beginning of popular topics. However, bravery had a cruel cost. Critics called her reckless, co-workers mocked her, and management reacted angrily. Every broadcast was like balancing on a tightrope over unemployment. If you make a mistake or say something inappropriate, it could end. She fought her way up to WBLS in New York, the radio equivalent of Mount Everest, by 1994. The city's airways were congested, merciless, and bloodthirsty. Wendy stood by herself beneath the red glow of the on-air, aware that every sentence was a lifeline and a risk. She leaned in rather than hid. She exposed her own truths with startling candor and spoke truths others had buried. She admitted on air that she had struggled with drugs. She acknowledged how devastating miscarriages can be. These weren't ratings-boosting stunts. Her audience felt every cut as she exposed these wounds. In the cruelest irony, her empire was built on the tragedies that had almost brought her down. She used her microphone as a sword and a shield. She was scarred by every confession. Every scar, however, brought millions closer. She gave America a shaky, frail human being who was prepared to bleed in order to heal others. Not a polished celebrity. She once thought, "I found my calling in a booth where nobody could see me, only hear me." She became iconic in that anonymity. Wendy Williams climbed in the dark, paying for every inch of success with pain. From the desolate station of St. Croix to the battlefield of Philadelphia and the thunderous stage of New York. The tragedy of her personal suffering, the cruelty of rejection, and the humiliation of early failure all served as fuel for a voice that would not be silenced. She demonstrated a lesson greater than herself in the process, that the very scars we are afraid to show can end up being the things that keep other people alive. Even the most broken spirits don't always go away quietly. They get up and show the world how to pay attention. After decades of squeezing her way through radio booths where her voice was frequently questioned, Wendy Williams made history in 2008 when she took the stage on television at the age of 44. America was rocked by the Wendy Williams Show's national syndication debut. Wendy was honest, straightforward, and disarming, in contrast to other daytime hosts who crafted their words into safe smiles. She confronted guests rather than merely interviewing them. Not only did she provide celebrity news, but she also made it a weekly ritual that millions of people watched. "How you doing?" was her catchphrase, and it echoed across the nation. She was a friend and a provocateur in living rooms from New York to Los Angeles because of her blend of sass and sincerity. It was a huge success. The ratings soared. Wendy herself became a cultural phenomenon, and her audience grew fervently devoted. She dominated daytime television for 13 seasons. A remarkable accomplishment for a black woman in an area where voices like hers have historically been silenced. She was nominated for an Emmy, made magazine covers, and became one of America's talk show icons. Wendy was more than just a host to her fans. She was a friend, a well-known voice that others dared only whisper. However, what could be more tragic than understanding that the same openness that created your kingdom could also pose a threat to its destruction? Her show was a recipe for controversy from the start. Her Hot Topics segment became a lightning rod after being moved from radio to television. She talked candidly about public figures, politicians, and celebrities. While some praised her for her bravery, others denounced her for her cruelty. She became a target because of the same openness that made her famous. The tabloids ate up everything she said. Every mistake she made was met with criticism. Additionally, her comments became daily firestorms on social media. Wendy didn't flinch, though. She frequently remarked to her audience, "I say it like I mean it." And that was her creed. But there was a price for every audacious statement. She carried the crushing burden of being hated and loved, sometimes in the same broadcast. Every headline was a wound, every show was a gamble. Millions continued to watch, though. It's because of the tension, not despite it. Wendy shared the unvarnished truth as she saw it, something no one else dared to do. But messy but polarizing. The cost of that truth was measured in fatigue as well as in criticism. It required arduous preparation to produce 5 shows a week, each of which lasted almost an hour. All information was passed through Wendy's voice, including updated scripts, confirmed rumors, and guest briefings. The hours of rehearsal, the sore feet and stilettos, and the frayed nerves from knowing that one wrong word could make headlines the next day, were not captured by the cameras, but they did capture her commanding presence. Television during the day was not a haven. It was a battleground. Both the arrows and the applause were genuine. A lesser person would have been crushed by the barrage of rumors, criticism, and scrutiny that Wendy faced during the height of her fame. She was doing more than just hosting a talk show. Every day she was on trial before the public opinion court. She also never gave up her microphone, despite her occasional stumbles. It was an act of defiance in and of itself to simply show up and ask, "How are you doing?" With a tired smile. The Wendy Williams Show had evolved beyond mere entertainment by the middle of the decade. It served as a cultural mirror reflecting America's insatiable curiosity about rumors, the truth, and the fuzziness of the distinctions between the two. Wendy appeared fearless to her audience. She was reckless in the eyes of her critics. However, there was one thing that both sides agreed on. It was impossible to ignore her. Her crown and her cross were that duality. The crown grew heavier as the years passed. The glittering sets, wigs, and glamour were visible to the general public. They were blind to the loneliness of withdrawing into silence every night after hours of non-stop conversation, the toll of never-ending filming schedules, and the pressure of ratings battles. She was already 53 years old and had endured more time in the line of fire than many of her contemporaries ever did. What could be more eerie than making millions laugh while gradually losing the ability to laugh yourself? Her body had already started to warn behind the bright lights. Fatigue that didn't seem to go away with rest. Aches that makeup couldn't cover up. Every season etched a deeper weariness. The quiet truth was overpowered by the thunderous applause. When they push past their limits, even the most powerful voices suffer consequences. Wendy Williams revolutionized daytime television for more than 10 years, not only with her candor but also with her determination to stand when her entire being begged her to sit down. There was more to the Wendy Williams Show than just television. It was a combination of catharsis, confrontation, and confession. She taught a generation that success is never free by bearing the weight of honesty for 13 years under the spotlight of cameras. Her story taught us a difficult lesson. Even people who appear unbreakable are still human, frail, and limited, and while honesty can inspire, it can also drain. Perhaps this is why her legacy endures. Not because she was perfect, but rather because she demonstrated to the world the courage required to face the hidden cost of truth. She had the ability to control the airwaves, dominate the stage, and carry millions of people in her palm. However, Wendy Williams secretly yearned for something that the spotlight could never offer. The stability of a home, the security of love. Wendy thought she had finally found it in 1994, when she was 30 years old and at the pinnacle of her radio career. He was Bertrand Bert Girigori, a man who appeared to provide the security her restless spirit had always sought. For Wendy, their wedding was a huge event, but it wasn't a media spectacle. She walked down the aisle with a sliver of hope stitched into every step after years of living, under the harsh glare of rejection, controversy, and the never-ending grind of radio. She wore more than just a dress. She wore the hope that this union would be the stability she had been seeking since she was a young girl, a promise to finally calm the storms inside her. She dared to think she could have it all during those initial weeks. She had used fire to build her career, and now the love that could keep her soul stable. But beneath the vows and the lace, there was another battle going on, one that no husband could put an end to with ease. Wendy continued to struggle with cocaine, a habit she had maintained for a large portion of her radio career. She later acknowledged that after long days at the station, she would return home exhausted and dependent, reaching for the drug as though it were a shield against loneliness and exhaustion. What could be more devastating than bearing the burden of a personal conflict while standing on the threshold of a new love? She aspired to be a stable partner and the ideal wife. Addiction, however, is a nasty intruder. It erodes trust, sharpens arguments, and permeates silence. Within months, their marriage's foundation began to show cracks. Once dismissed in the radiance of courtship, minor disagreements grew into impassable chasms. The warmth she had imagined dissipated into coldness, affection into distance, and conversations into arguments. The silence in her own home was intolerable to a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to be heard over radio static. Less than a year after she said "I do" in 1995, the marriage had fallen apart. Hope gave way to paperwork, signatures, and silence. And there was only the stark finality of a love story too short to endure. No children to ease the loss, no common legacy to unite them. For Wendy, the divorce was more than just a formality. On top of the silent shame of addiction, there was another scar. She wore the glitz of rising stardom in public. Privately, she was burdened by a failed marriage and an unresolved dependency. This was perhaps the most unsettling fact. In the privacy of her marriage, she felt voiceless and helpless against the collapse of love and the hold of cocaine, despite the world applauding her as a fearless voice on the air. The stark contrast served as a reminder that success in the workplace cannot prevent the human heart from shattering. Moreover, cheers cannot mask the murmurs of a personal conflict. She therefore took more than just loneliness with her when she left her first marriage. She had the terrifying knowledge that love, like fame, could be short-lived and that even the most optimistic promises could be broken by unresolved internal conflicts. It vanished within a year. After leaving her first marriage with nothing but silence and the pain of disappointment, Wendy Williams had already experienced the agony of failure once. She promised herself that she would never again lose herself so easily. However, just as one chapter was coming to an end, another was starting. She met Kevin Hunter, a man who seemed to reflect her fire with his self-assurance and steady demeanor. She dared to think that what started as a spark in the darkness of heartbreak could endure. She would later admit, "I thought this time it would be different." Wendy was a rising radio star at the time, and she said, "I thought I had found my forever." Her voice was unavoidable, fearless and sharp. Her restless energy was calmed by Kevin's assurance, and his quiet strength served as a counterbalance to her outward bluster. Away from the microphones, their relationship grew stronger through late-night chats, candid laughter, and the kind of closeness that provided Wendy with stability, something she had long yearned for. The assurance that she would be able to rely on someone else at last. By November 1999, Wendy and Kevin were married at the age of 35. For Wendy, the wedding was monumental, even though it wasn't a scene with flashing lights and cameras. Every stride seemed to be a bold affirmation that love could still blossom in the wake of loss. She wore a fragile dream in addition to a gown, that she would be anchored by this union, that the storms she had fought in lonely apartments and radio booths might finally subside. Wendy thought she had found refuge, not fame, when she saw the woman who had once battled so hard for every word on air, now standing in a gown, vulnerable, her voice breaking only to say, "I do." That day, for the first time in years, she let herself breathe as though love itself could be her haven, whispering to herself, "This time I can exhale. This time I can be safe." However, a marriage cannot be protected from difficulties by vows alone. The cruelest test of all was the one Wendy had to endure. One miscarriage after another. She carried hope with her every time she carried life, and every time she buried that hope in silence. What could be more heartbreaking than envisioning a nursery decorated or folding small, unwearable clothes, only to pass an empty room in real life? Wendy later came clean on air, saying, "I wanted to be a mother, but my body wouldn't let me." Her words exposed her in front of millions of people, but they were the reality she had experienced. Her candor made her both popular and controversial. Grief reverberated in her heart like an unstoppable echo, leaving invisible graves. At one point, she remembered the intolerable routine of waking up every morning and asking herself, "Why me? Why not now?" She did not hide her sadness in contrast to many celebrities. She turned personal tragedy into a public confession by speaking it out loud. By doing this, she gave voice to innumerable women who had suffered through the same silent suffering. She seemed to be teaching with each trembling sentence, "Gap unspoken is grief that consumes." Vulnerability became Wendy's weapon and her wound. The miracle that she had almost given up on happened in 2000. She gave birth to her son, Kevin Hunter Jr. Despite the burden of her many losses, Wendy held him in that hospital room as if he were a covenant rather than just a baby. That happiness could still emerge after a lifetime of sorrow. Whispering a prayer of thanks into his first breaths, she kissed his forehead while crying. She later remarked, "He's my saving grace." Every tiny hand grasp, every midnight cry, every whispered "Mom," was evidence to Wendy that love, despite its abrasions, could still bring about life. Her son was more than her kid. He was her salvation, the tangible proof that hope could endure the most severe physical betrayals. She was rejuvenated by motherhood, which filled the voids left by loss. For a while, the triumph of life after loss seemed to stabilize marriage itself. She and Kevin turned their story into a mission when they founded the Hunter Foundation, which funds drug abuse programs, helps families, and transforms scars into service. They seemed indestructible to the outside world. A couple who turned suffering into a platform by facing tragedy head-on and coming out on top with a purpose. The glamorous host and her unwavering husband are creating a legacy in addition to a family, but there were long shadows behind the facade. In betrayal, the same man who had held her hand in the delivery room now clasped another's. There were no rumors or conjectures about Kevin's adultery. It exploded in headlines that screamed, appeared in tabloids, and was discussed on the very gossip circuits that Wendy had once controlled. The image of a woman unraveling as she entered courtrooms was frozen in time by paparazzi bulbs, which transformed her grief into a theatrical performance. Her personal anguish was displayed in public. The revelation was an ironic wound for the woman whose empire was based on telling the truth. She had told millions of people the unvarnished truth, only to find that the most significant truth in her own life had been hidden beneath falsehoods. Her heart was not the only place that hurt. In addition to being her spouse, Kevin served as her manager, business associate, and co-architect for every agreement, performance, and charitable endeavor. He had betrayed more than just his vows. It was the destruction of a whole world that she had built over many years. Shredded contracts. Hunter Foundation disbanded. The appearance of unity also accompanied it. And the blow got worse when the court settlement came. Wendy was left to cling to the show and her reputation, while Kevin left with financial concessions. At what felt like blood's price, she had maintained her empire. It was more than just heartbreak for Wendy. Her home and her empire were reduced to rubble due to an earthquake. She filed for divorce in 2019 following 20 years of marriage. The separation was completed by the beginning of 2020. Wendy's hand shook as she signed the documents that put a quarter-century of dreams to rest in a courtroom crowded with cameras. One headline can undo 2 decades, she later admitted. "I thought we'd be together forever. I thought I'd grow old with him." Devoid of her usual bluster, those remarks were more scathing than any rumors she had ever spread. This was not a hot topic segment. Her life was collapsing under the most intense scrutiny of all. For Wendy, the divorce represented more than just the breaking of a relationship. She had carried a dream for 25 years and it was being buried. In addition to losing her spouse, she also lost a confidant, a collaborator, and the shaky hope that love could be her haven. It was ruthless irony. Every night, the woman who had brought laughter to America's afternoons now went back to silence. The walls that used to reverberate with family plans and conversation now pressed in with a sense of emptiness. Every shadow served as a reminder that everything had an end date. The pain of a mother who was unable to save an entire house for her child was an even more profound wound that was hidden beneath the headlines. Kevin Jr. had almost reached adulthood. However, Wendy harbored the agonizing belief that he had witnessed their family's disintegration in real time. His turning points were marred by loss and treachery. The cut no camera could catch was when she once confessed in private, "I wanted him to have what I never did, a home that stayed whole, and I couldn't give it to him." The shame of a mother whose public victories were unable to protect her son from personal wounds. But there was still one light in the ruins: her own son. As the living evidence that not everything that came from that union had died, he became her fulcrum amidst the turmoil of courtrooms and the resentment of headlines. He was Wendy's salvation as well as her child, the unwavering reminder that something lasting and pure could endure even in the face of treachery. It was a harsh but obvious lesson. Not only can fame magnify love, but it can also magnify betrayal. Faithfulness cannot be purchased with money. The heart cannot be protected by success. Even though they are resilient, children bear the silent scars of broken homes. Wendy's second marriage served as both her greatest victory and her most painful scar. Triumph since it bestowed upon her the gift of motherhood, wound because it destroyed her faith in love and collaboration. Her story also conveyed a sobering truth to the millions of people who watched. We may be honored by that applause, but it won't shield us from the betrayals that happen closest to home. In 2020, Wendy stood wounded but unfazed by the time the divorce papers' ink dried. She had lost the illusion of eternity, a manager, a husband, and part of the fortune she had amassed. She was still herself, though. Her legacy would always include the tears she shed as well as the laughter she inspired. And that might be her story's most eerie reverberation. She used honesty to build her empire, but lies brought it down. After 20 years of love and a single headline, it was gone like smoke in the wind. The loss that followed shattered her heart, if betrayal had already cracked it. Just a few months after her divorce was finalized, Wendy Williams suffered yet another cruel blow in 2020 when her mother, Shirley Williams, passed away. It was more than grief. It was destruction on top of destruction. A wound inside a wound that could not be covered by cheers. Shirley was more than just her mom. She was her compass, her anchor, the silent force that kept her afloat during her storms of fame, addiction, and rejection. Wendy was already reeling from the breakdown of a 20-year marriage, so losing her at such a vulnerable time would be like feeling the earth give way completely beneath her feet. She later whispered, "It felt like the bottom dropped out of my life." Her customary bluster vanished into an unmistakable silence. It couldn't have come at a worse moment. Outside, the world struggled with its own problems. However, Wendy's private life faded into obscurity. Her health was deteriorating, and her personal problems were growing, and she was already turning away from television. The last straw was the phone call informing her that her mother had left. The instant fatigue gave way to collapse. Wendy was not the dazzling host at the funeral. Instead, she was a distraught daughter holding tissues rather than cards while wearing black and hiding behind dark glasses. Her arrival was captured on camera, but the hollow scream inside her chest was lost on the lens. She moved like a ghost for weeks. The woman whose candor had once electrified America's afternoons now sat hollowed out, gazing at empty chairs where her mother had once sat. At a telephone that would never again be able to transmit her mother's voice. The glittering trophies of her success made her apartment feel colder than any backstage hallway. She could get flowers from fame, but not her mother's hand. It was the loneliness of death as well as death itself that made the loss intolerable. Wendy had always lived her life in public, telling millions about her addiction, betrayals, and miscarriages. However, even the brightest studio lights cannot reveal such a great deal of grief. By herself, she relived memories like brittle film reels. As a child, she was guided by her mother's gentle hand. Before the show, she whispered some gentle advice, the unwavering love that had endured all the scandals. All of it now only existed in memory. It was cruelly ironic. She lost her mother, her soulmate, at the same time that she lost her marriage, her life, and business partner. She was fighting for her dignity after one betrayal. She struggled for her sanity after one death. Together, they created a void inside of her that could not be filled by accolades, money, or ratings. For Wendy, the fall of love and the quiet of loss were one harsh symphony of absence rather than two distinct tragedies. Her heart could not keep up with her show's limp. Her eyes clouded mid-sentence, her laughter ringing thinner than before, and her faltering were all visible to her fans. Behind the bright sets, the catchphrases, and the wigs, there was a daughter who had no foundation left to rely on, not a queen of talk. She acknowledged, "I just wasn't myself anymore." Words devoid of any performance, they were more powerful than any monologue she had ever given. Although she never wanted to teach the lesson of her mother's death, it was ingrained in her narrative. That fame cannot protect you from the most universal truth in life, no matter how high it takes you. The people who molded you will depart one day, and once they do, the peaceful solace of a mother's embrace cannot be replaced by an empire, a legacy, or thunderous applause. In addition to being a personal tragedy, Wendy saw Shirley's passing as the end of a chapter in her life that she had never wanted to read. She was alone after her divorce. She became untethered after losing her mother. She also retreated from television and the misconception that power equates to invincibility as she moved away from the limelight. She would learn that true strength can sometimes be as simple as having the guts to continue breathing, despite having a broken heart. Wendy Williams soon found herself fighting an even more vicious foe, her own body, as if betrayal and grief hadn't already broken her spirit and hollowed her heart. She had dominated daytime television and taken over radio booths for decades, using her voice as her empire, her sword, and her haven. However, that same body started to rebel in the late 2010s. Every symptom serves as a harsh reminder that death's ticking clock cannot be stopped by a crown, notoriety, or wealth. The first rupture occurred in a brutally real moment that felt like it was staged for horror. Halloween in the year 2017. Wendy's tall, usually unflappable figure, dressed as the Statue of Liberty, abruptly faltered, before collapsing live. On television, her painted face was frozen in panic as her eyes widened, her green costume's fabric crumpling under the stage lights, and the silent gasp of millions of people watching at home were all captured on camera. She returned in a matter of minutes, her smile stretched like a mask as she insisted she was fine. However, the picture persisted, burning into memory. It was shocking television for the world. It was like a bell being rung for Wendy. The instant the talkative queen became aware that her throne was quivering beneath her. She had been fighting a quiet war behind the glittering sets and dazzling wigs. Her body's rhythm was being twisted against her, her moods were being distorted, and her strength was being depleted by Graves's disease, an autoimmune condition that attacks the thyroid. She openly told her audience, "My thyroid has been an issue for years. I just can't handle it sometimes." Her openness, however, only touched the surface of the suffering. Sleepless nights of restless fatigue that would not go away. Swelling that was impossible to hide with the thickest foundation. When she held her cue cards, her once assured hands began to shake, betraying her in the most obvious way. Every broadcast evolved into a battle between her spirit and her deteriorating body, rather than just a performance. Then, in May 2020, the stage collapsed, completely removing it. This time, the scene was not framed by studio lights, cameras, or an audience. Wendy was discovered unconscious in the quiet of her house. Several blood transfusions were necessary for her survival. Her life was reduced to a delicate rhythm that was only disturbed by the constant beeping of hospital monitors. Only the sterile hiss of oxygen and the silent fear of death pressing down were audible, without any catchphrases or cheers. This was a plunge into the deepest shadows for a woman who had previously lived in the spotlight. It wasn't just a collapse. It served as a harsh reminder that even legends can die, not in front of millions of people, but by themselves. That was a pivotal night. Exhaustion turned into a crisis. The crisis turned into a retreat. And that was when Wendy Williams, the voice that had carried her empire and the Queen of Candor, finally understood. The weak body that could no longer support her crown was her greatest enemy. Not scandal or treachery, but the suffering continued. It only got heavier. Betraying the very body that had once carried her across stages with fire, Wendy disclosed that she was now suffering from lymphedema, a chronic condition that left her legs painfully swollen. Her presence was towering, her stride defiant, and those legs had once strutted in stilettos. They were now forced to circulate where her body could no longer support it, bound every day in compression wraps and tied to a machine for 45 minutes at a time. Her candor broke under the weight of her grief as she said, "I can't wear heels the way I used to." It went beyond vanity. Identity was the issue. Every step was a reminder that even standing up straight was now a victory stolen from defeat. For a woman whose strength had always been inextricably linked to the stage she controlled, her chair sat empty more often than filled after 2021. The guest hosts came and went, their voices resonating where hers had been. She was losing the ritual that had characterized her life, 5 days a week, 1 hour a day, to sporadic appearances. The day the curtain came down was June 2022. The last episode of The Wendy Williams Show aired, The woman whose name was inscribed in the title did not leave as the cameras rolled and the credits rolled. Rather, her chair was silent and empty, a monument stronger than any parting remark. The message was devastating to millions who had been watching for more than 10 years. Their afternoons were no longer filled with The Voice. The legal system deprives her of her autonomy, just as illness deprives her of energy. A New York court ruled later in 2022 that Wendy was incapable of handling her own affairs and placed her under financial guardianship. It was a second exile for a woman who had founded her empire on speaking freely and independently. Once unafraid to take on politicians and celebrities, the Queen of Talk now had other people's signatures dictating her life. It was unimaginable to her fans. It was devastating to Wendy. The suppression of freedom itself, not a voice. Then came the most devastating blow of all in 2024. Her doctors diagnosed her with frontotemporal dementia, FTD, and primary progressive aphasia, PPA. It was more than just a sickness to the woman who had made her fortune on words. The irony was cosmic. PPA gradually eliminates language, destroying the capacity to communicate, understand, and express oneself. Even the brightest minds become shadows of themselves as a result of FTD's destruction of identity, judgment, and behavior. Once leaning forward to ask America, "How are you doing?" with fire, the host now found it difficult to complete her own sentences. Syllable by syllable, the voice that had been her crown was being taken away. A slow-motion theft, seeing a woman who had dedicated her life to communication lose the very talent that made her unique could not be more cruel. Every pause and every broken sentence was more than a symptom. A tragedy was playing out in real time. Nevertheless, Wendy remained loyal to herself and did not disappear in obscurity. Even her silence became one last act of candor as she let the world know. By doing so, she served as a reminder to millions that having the guts to confront pain head-on is what defines dignity. Her suffering left ruthless but indisputable lessons. Health cannot be purchased with money. Pain cannot be masked by applause. The flesh cannot be shielded from weakness by fame. Wendy's downfall was caused by the silent betrayal of her own body, which served as a reminder that even the most powerful voices are fallible, rather than by scandal or a lack of skill. And when the body doesn't follow the spirit, even empires fall apart. And there was still a light in the ruins. Even in her illness, Wendy's story served as a mirror for millions of people battling invisible struggles. Evidence that vulnerability is a deeper form of strength rather than weakness. Even though she appeared frail, her rare appearances were accompanied by the defiance of a woman who refused to go into hiding. Her legacy has expanded beyond the controversies she sparked, the headlines she commanded, and the laughter she inspired. It's also the fortitude she displayed when everything else was taken away. A final lesson is now taught by the woman who once stood tall in heels, who transformed confession into culture and gossip into gospel. That strength comes from standing broken in front of the world and daring to live, not from never falling. Both the inspiration and the tragedy of illness are indisputable for Wendy Williams. She made her voice heard, and the echo is still there, despite the efforts of illness to muffle it. It permeates every catchphrase, open admission, and life she impacted. Evidence that integrity can endure beyond silence, heal, and teach even when it is broken or fading. Wendy Williams is in the latter stages of a career that was once blazing with unquenchable passion, and she no longer lives near the glaring lights of TV studios. She was once the unstoppable queen of conversation during the day, but now she is a woman juggling deteriorating health, dwindling independence, and the constant burden of memory. Nevertheless, her story still matters here, in the silent hallways of her present. More than ever, maybe. Before their marriage ended, Wendy and Kevin Hunter shared a large mansion in Livingston, New Jersey. Later, she exchanged that estate for Manhattan's svelte glass skyscrapers, where her high-rise apartment provided expansive views of the city she had conquered. She also maintained a home in Miami, the glitzy hideaway where she hoped to find tranquility in the sun for a while. However, things have changed. Many of these properties have since been sold under the court-imposed financial guardianship. The choices made by those in charge of overseeing Wendy's affairs rather than by Wendy herself. The stark reality of a woman who once controlled an empire and is now constrained, not by walls but by circumstance, remains, rather than the vastness of her real estate holdings. Wendy's net worth has decreased from its initial estimate of $40 million. She only has a portion of her previous wealth due to legal disputes, medical expenses, and the demise of her show. According to reports, she is currently worth between $500,000 and $1 million. However, Wendy never considered money to be the ultimate indicator of her success. The material reminders of her labors are still treasured by her. Each of the more than 300 wigs in her renowned collection is a crown in and of itself. Designer handbags from Chanel to Birkin adorned her shelves. Even standing was an endurance test because of her shoes, which were once high heels that commanded the stage but are now bittersweet reminders of the days before lymphedema. But material possessions have never been her greatest treasure. After years of heartache and miscarriage, her only son, Kevin Hunter Jr., was born in 2000. He continues to be Wendy's savior. The living example of how love endures despite illness and betrayal, Kevin Jr., a young man now pursuing his own career, has supported Wendy through media attention and hospital stays, serving as a constant reminder that motherhood, not scandal, is the true story behind Wendy's tale. She has repeatedly stated, "He's my anchor." Furthermore, she is more than just a TV personality to him. She is a mother. However, Wendy's everyday existence is anything but simple. She continues to receive treatment for lymphedema, spending extended periods of time strapped to compression machines and having her legs restrained, while circulation is forced into areas where it no longer flows naturally. Victories are now measured in steps, each one an act of defiance by the woman who once walked across stages in glistening stilettos. In 2024, the diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia and primary progressive aphasia added yet another cruel burden: the gradual loss of independence, speech, and comprehension. It is a cosmic cruelty to a woman who lived through words. It feels like a theft in progress, syllable by syllable, as the very gift that gave her her empire is taken away with every broken sentence and excessive pause. Wendy hasn't hidden, though. Even her silence became testimony when she decided to make her diagnosis public. By doing this, she has taught millions of people that courage involves facing what cannot be spoken and speaking loudly. Even now, her story serves as a mirror, reflecting both the universality of human suffering and the frailty of celebrity. No amount of wealth, praise, or publicity can shield us from the harsh realities of life. Furthermore, no empire, no matter how glitzy, can overshadow time's inevitable course. Her legacy has not been erased, even though illness has taken away her crown. Wendy Williams will always be one of the few Black women, and one of the few women who control the conversation during the day in America. She redefined what it meant to be open, fearless, and unapologetically herself for 13 seasons. She turned confession into catharsis and gossip into a cultural ritual. She provided her audience with company in addition to shock and laughter. What others whispered, she dared to say. She also used the boldest ink in media history to write her name. Even though her life is now quieter and more precarious, it is still very important, because she provides a last lesson in her suffering. That strength is the capacity to bear suffering with open eyes, not the absence of it. That dignity is determined by the bravery to live visibly despite being broken, not by contracts or crowns. What does this leave us with, then? We are left with more than just a recollection of the glamorous host in high heels and glitzy wigs yelling, "How are you?" into American living rooms. It reveals a more profound reality. The woman in the crown is human, frail, limited, and, in her honesty, eternal. We can only hope and pray that the upcoming chapters bring Wendy Williams peace, that her days are made up of moments of solace, love, and dignity, rather than news stories and conflicts. May she be surrounded by people who affirm her value. She lived loudly, loved fiercely, and taught us all that honesty, even when broken, still heals, not as a host or a celebrity. We now turn to you, dear friends. In honor of Wendy's bravery, please like this video if her voice used to brighten your afternoons, if her laughter ever made you feel less alone, or if her story tonight moved you. And leave a heart in the comments for a woman who gave her life to words and who now teaches us in silence what true strength means. A tiny token of love, tenacity, and unity.